No matter how humble their background, every swordsman's ultimate dream has always been to compete in the Cartamen tournament and earn a place in the Empire's elite knight order, Ace. A passionate young swordsman swore to himself that he would prove to his entire family he had what it took to make that dream a reality. Another contestant vividly recalled his master's words. Once you pick up a sword, the only destination worth aiming for is the Cartamen arena. In truth, Cartamen was a massive public tournament, packed with grueling trials and fierce competition. Out of more than 100 competitors fighting tooth and nail, the organizers had reserved only 5 golden spots for the Ace Knights. The real twist was that the power of life and death, the final say in choosing those 5 knights, belonged entirely to the public. Rousing calls echoed across the realm, urging every citizen of the Empire to cast their vote for their favorite knight. Emperor Carlos Lafayette of the Shinodia Empire could only clutch his head and let out a heavy sigh at his beloved daughter. Losing his patience, the emperor demanded to know if his daughter had lost her mind coming up with such a bizarre scheme. The princess, however, was brimming with excitement as she pitched her plan to select royal knights through a nationwide vote. When Edith pressed her father on what bothered him, the voting or the tournament, the emperor threw his hands up in despair, admitting he couldn't wrap his head around any of it. The emperor reminded her that using a tournament as an excuse to make people slaughter each other to the death was the tyrannical game of Beauvoir. He emphasized that Beauvoir was the very tyrant both father and daughter had risked everything in a bloody revolution to overthrow. As it turned out, Princess Edith Lafayette was a genius alchemist whose powerful magical devices had paved the way for the revolution's success. Back then, the terrified tyrant had branded her a devil because of her unnatural mastery of alchemy at such a young age. Edith pushed up her goggles, thinking that calling her a devil was a bit harsh. Closing her eyes, she reflected that her rapid learning was simply because she retained all the memories of her past life. In her previous life, Edith was a talented TV producer in South Korea who churned out hit after hit, only to have the credit stolen every single time. Her senior colleague, Kim, had smoothly convinced her to let him take full credit for the scripts and directing, claiming his big name attracted more media attention. He had even generously promised to keep her name as an assistant producer, swearing he would never leave her behind. Watching her senior triumphantly take home the grand prize, all she could do was swallow her bitterness and vow to put her own name on her work next time. Edith let out a soft sigh as she recalled the sudden end to her previous life. She realized she had been reincarnated as a princess in a fantasy romance world. The moment she was born, her father burst into tears while holding her, promising a lifetime of love and making her think she was in a heartwarming family drama. To her shock, he immediately roared that he would risk his life to overthrow the tyrant Beauvoir to protect her, turning her life into a brutal survival story. Edith wondered if producing too many dramatic survival shows in her past life was karma coming back to make her fight for survival in this one. To stay alive, she combined her natural alchemy talent with modern knowledge to craft state-of-the-art weapons, from magic firearms and explosive bombs to tracking devices. After countless struggles, the tyrant Beauvoir was finally captured by the Revolutionary Army and sent to the executioner's block. Emperor Carlos grabbed the tyrant by the scruff of his neck and declared before all the citizens that their darkest days were officially over. He vowed that the senseless blood matches that claimed the lives of honorable knights would be abolished forever. The blood matches were essentially a slaughterhouse where the finest warriors were forced to butcher one another until only one was left standing. Though the final survivor was honored as the emperor's royal knight, the bitter truth behind the title was unbearable. Every single one of those victors chose death over bending the knee to serve as the tyrant's henchman. Only a single person remained as the rare exception who survived those bloody, brutal days. Even though Carlos's deposed royal bloodline had successfully rebelled and punished the tyrant, the days that followed were far from peaceful. Confusion and disappointment spread among the citizens as the new policies failed to deliver the prosperity and rewards they had hoped for. The new emperor's credibility plummeted when the nobles who once joined the uprising turned their backs and boycotted the council. Whispers filled the streets, with people doubting the new emperor's competence and lamenting that nothing felt different from the tyrant's reign. Anxious, Emperor Carlos asked if hosting a tournament now would make the public think the crown was reviving the brutal arena of the past, but Edith insisted this was an entirely different story. Edith explained that she wanted to hold a fair tournament to honor the founding de Equus knights, just as the wise rulers of old had done. Only then did Emperor Carlos finally grasp the true meaning behind honoring the founding knights. With a confident smile, Edith proposed reviving the Grand Knight Selection Tournament known as Cartamen. History recorded that the first emperor had fought side by side with the 5 de Equus knights to forge a mighty empire. In memory of those 5 heroes, Cartamen was held as a traditional ceremony to select the 5 greatest knights whenever a new emperor took the throne. It wasn't just a martial contest, it was a masterstroke of political theater designed to shape the empire's image before the people. The 5 chosen elites would replace the traditional coronation, capturing the undivided attention of the entire populace and becoming the hottest topic across the empire. Edith excitedly likened the concept to a royal idol group handcrafted by the throne. Emperor Carlos was still worried about the absent nobility, given their collective boycott of the royal summons. Edith firmly declared that this time around, the royal family had no need for haughty, stuck-up nobles anyway. She enthusiastically announced that she would let the citizens vote for their knights, applying the exact formula from the idol survival shows of her past life. Edith argued that giving the public the power to choose the de Equus would direct all attention to the new court, proving how different they were from the old tyrant. The princess playfully asked her father if he wasn't curious to see what an ideal team molded by the people would look like. Stroking his beard, Emperor Carlos pondered the idea and gradually warmed up to his daughter's bold plan. Notice boards announcing the Cartamen tournament, open to anyone over 18 who could wield a weapon, went up everywhere, sending the streets into a frenzy. The public remained skeptical, terrified that this was just another disguised death trap designed to feed innocent people to the slaughter. Yet, a spark of hope began to flicker among some who saw this as a chance to change their lives if Cartamen was truly fair and transparent. The crowd murmured about the grim tragedy of how every hero forced into the blood matches had either perished or taken their own life, save for one sole survivor. Torn between curiosity and dread, people gossiped about whether that lone surviving monster would dare show his face to register this time. From the shadows in the distance, a young man with dark, haunted eyes, hidden beneath a deep cowl, quietly watched it all unfold. An attendant rushed in with grim news. Every single star candidate personally scouted by the princess had flatly refused to join and sent the royal messengers packing. The servant sighed, explaining that the talented knights had lost faith in the crown and feared offending the nobility, making the search for talent harder than ever. Resting her chin on her hand, Edith realized this tense situation was too critical to leave in the hands of subordinates. The princess stood up with fierce resolve, deciding it was time to personally hunt down contestants for her show. Lord Thierry Bourne of the Pious region let out a mocking laugh upon hearing that the princess had traveled all the way to see him. Holding the invitation with a smirk, Thierry smugly assumed the princess was desperate after being rejected from her ridiculous little contest. Tossing the letter aside, the lord scoffed that letting commoners vote was childish nonsense, telling his men to let the princess do whatever she pleased. When his guard hesitantly asked how to respond, Thierry coldly told him to say he was busy dealing with a dangerous death row prisoner and had no time for guests. Despite his subordinates' worry about keeping the princess waiting, Thierry sneered, wanting to use this chance to teach the showboating royal family a lesson about where true nobility stood. The prisoner's sinewy, tightly bound hands clenched as Thierry continued grumbling about the crown flattering commoners, instead of rewarding noble contributions after the revolution. Thierry aggressively declared he was about to break the limbs of the pirate sympathizer and dump his corpse into the sea, mocking that the fragile princess might faint if she saw it. The surrounding crowd and guards began to stir restlessly as the execution drew near. A guard gasped in horror as the heavy ropes binding the death row inmate suddenly snapped clean off. The shirtless prisoner, rippling with muscle, instantly swung his wooden stock and sent the executioner flying in a split second. Watching from the balcony, Thierry was left stunned as the prisoner tore through the guards, knocking them down one after another in the blink of an eye. The young convict with a spiderweb tattoo on his arm deftly dodged incoming strikes, looking for an escape route. He kicked off the fortress wall and leapt from the heights, carving a bloody path to freedom. Thierry's eyes widened in fury as he roared at his men to capture the fugitive alive at all costs. Meanwhile, Edith was flipping through files, grading Thierry Bourne an A in looks and combat skills, prime clickbait material, even if his personality was a solid F. Edith figured that no matter how awful his attitude was, he could still drive massive engagement for the show, so she decided to go in and meet him. Just then, a massive, muscular figure dropped straight from the sky right where Edith was standing, nearly giving her a heart attack. The two collided hard and tumbled to the ground amid piercing screams. The servants panicked and screamed for help as the hulking death row prisoner landed right on top of the princess, sending papers scattering everywhere. Inches away from the princess's face was the remarkably sharp, handsome visage of the mysterious young man. Amid the chaotic mess, his piercing gaze and intense masculine charm stood out undeniably. The frantic shouts of guards hunting down the escaped convict echoed nearby, putting the young man instantly on high alert. He scrambled to his feet, preparing to make a run for it as the guards closed in from all sides. His bare feet moved with lightning speed across the cold stone floor, desperately searching for a way out. Suddenly, a mysterious figure in a black cloak blocked his path and coldly ordered the prisoner to freeze. Clicking his tongue, the prisoner lunged forward, swinging the splintered piece of his wooden stock at the obstacle. A devastating strike came crashing down, but the cloaked figure effortlessly raised a single hand and caught it cold. The cloak shifted slightly to reveal striking white hair and unwavering eyes, locking them in a tense clash of raw power. Edith marveled inwardly at the shirtless warrior's impressive strength, daring to go toe-to-toe bare-handed with her personal guard. The young man braced himself, gritting his teeth against the overwhelming pressure. A guard quickly grabbed an innocent child and nervously threatened to kill them unless the man surrendered, aiming straight for his soft spot. Burning with rage, the young man fiercely condemned the Lord of Pious for sentencing someone who saved victims from pirates to death and stooping so low as to use a child as a human shield. The guards spat back that a mere slave-born mercenary who dared defy a lord had only death waiting for him. The young man briefly recalled the days he was hired by that very lord to suppress pirate raids. He had realized the bitter truth. If those hostages were dragged back to the castle, they would simply be turned into slaves anyway. Ignoring the soldiers' warnings, he took matters into his own hands and rescued all the hostages, never claiming it was out of goodness or noble virtue. It was simply because seeing their tragic plight reflected the bitter memories of his own childhood. The image of a frail old man tearing up in gratitude and promising to repay him for saving his grandchild's life came rushing back. Back then, the slave traders had only laughed at the old man's naivety, since stealing people from rival gangs was just another way to turn a profit. They had casually discussed what a handsome price the young boy would fetch on the market. The horrific memory of a red-hot branding iron searing into his flesh amid piercing screams flooded back in vivid detail. The young boy had sobbed in absolute despair as a cold blade pressed against his neck. A collective sigh of relief broke out as the suffocating tension momentarily eased. The young man finally gave in, standing motionless, surrounded by a bristling wall of spears and swords. Out of breath after the violent struggle, the guards finally pinned him to the ground in ropes and hurled insults at him. Lord Thierry furiously barked at his subordinates to drag the prisoner out, snap his limbs, and toss his carcass to the sharks. Edith's sweet voice suddenly chimed in, asking if he planned to hold a proper trial before carrying out the execution, making Thierry's heart skip a beat. Thierry froze in shock at the princess's sudden appearance, while she casually explained she had to track him down herself after hearing the Lord was too busy and stood her up. With a bright smile, Edith noted that an unverified case required a thorough reinvestigation, leaving Thierry stammering that this was an internal matter of Pious. Hearing the mention of pirate collusion, the bound young man instantly called it a setup, declaring they didn't have a shred of real evidence against him. Losing his composure, Thierry bellowed that his word was the law in Pious, and rushed to declare the young man's death sentence on the spot. Flashing a radiant smile, Edith casually announced that she was granting the young man an immediate royal pardon. She gently reminded him that the authority to grant pardons across the entire empire belonged strictly to the emperor and the crown heir, shutting down the lord completely. Thierry forced a smile and asked if the princess hadn't come to invite him to compete, bargaining that he would join if she stayed out of his internal affairs. Edith tilted her head with innocent detachment and replied that she no longer had any use for his services. The princess smugly thought to herself, now that she had landed an S-rank unpolished gem, why bother wasting energy on damaged second-rate goods? Rubbing his newly freed wrists, the young man asked in confusion why the princess had suddenly stepped in to save his life. Edith beamed and teased that before asking questions, the first thing he ought to do was offer a sincere thank you to his savior. The young man grew serious, demanding she state her terms for granting such a favor. He bitterly noted that nothing in this world came for free without a calculated transaction attached. The young man pressed her on what exactly a princess would want from someone like him in exchange for his life. Edith smiled brightly and revealed her only condition. She wanted him to enter Cartamen and fight to be the last one standing. The princess affirmed that this was all she needed, leaving the young man staring at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. He sighed, wondering if the royal family was so starved for contestants that they had to drag in a nobody like him just to fill the roster. Knowing he had no other way out, and this was his only lifeline, the young man agreed, but with a condition of his own. He pulled back his tunic without hesitation, declaring he would never hide the slave brand on his body. Edith's face lit up in full support, knowing a visible slave brand was the ultimate narrative hook to craft a viral, one-of-a-kind backstory. The young man wondered why on earth a princess wouldn't worry about saving face by recruiting a former slave, before Edith cheerfully introduced herself and asked for his name. Edith politely extended her small hand, offering a courteous introduction. The young man hesitated, reminding her of his lowly origins, and asking if a princess really wanted to shake hands with someone like him. Thinking this princess was truly one of a kind, he hesitantly introduced himself as Cousteau. Edith happily remarked that Cousteau was a wonderful name. Cousteau stared at the noble lady before him, his gaze a mix of utter bewilderment and a quiet, subtle flutter in his heart. Thrilled, Edith mentally tallied Cousteau's god-tier stats, from his raw melee skills and striking looks to his chivalrous aura, ecstatic to have secured an S-tier ratings magnet. The princess pumped her fist in silent celebration, feeling like the gods of entertainment were smiling down on her. The cloaked knight spoke in a low voice, asking if the princess truly believed a former slave could ever claim the title of de Equus. Edith insisted she made the demand because she knew Cousteau was more than capable, not because she would ever send someone to die in vain. The knight confessed he couldn't understand her thought process at all, including why she was so relentlessly trying to drag him into Cartamen. Edith pouted playfully at his rejection, but the knight replied that having someone like him around would only bring trouble. He called himself the official scapegoat of the entire empire, saying his presence would only drag the royal family's name through the mud. History recorded Dmitri Cassel as the sole victor who bent the knee to serve the tyrant, earning him the public's curse as a traitor who stepped over his comrade's blood for glory. Edith slammed her hand on the table and dismissed the rumors, declaring that whole narrative was one massive misunderstanding. She defended him, pointing out that Dmitri had never enjoyed luxury and only carried out his duties, and that he was the one who secretly opened the castle gates for the revolutionaries. Dmitri bitterly replied that in the eyes of the world he was just a spineless opportunist, a traitor stripped of honor. Edith suddenly grasped Dmitri's hand, firmly reassuring him that she had never once viewed him that way. She explained that it was precisely because she knew the truth that she fought to keep him alive, made him her guardian, and wanted him to compete openly as an S-rank knight. Under the setting sun, Edith gently held Dmitri's hand and told him her mind would never change. Whenever he was ready, the door would always be open. Dmitri asked thoughtfully what profit the princess could possibly gain by putting an infamous outcast like him in the arena. Edith gave him a knowing look, wondering why such a sharp man felt the need to ask such an obvious question. She secretly judged Dmitri as possessing peak survival instincts, paired with a sorrowful, hauntingly handsome face that looked like it carried 100 tons of tragic backstory. The former TV producer gave Dmitri's visuals a perfect score: fair skin, jewel-like red eyes, and cold silver hair that hit every audience demographic. Edith chuckled inwardly, knowing that top-tier visuals combined with a mountain of juicy drama was guaranteed to break the internet. Startled, Dmitri asked who the next candidate was on her list after so many had flatly turned her down. Edith excitedly flipped through her dossier, declaring that the next name was an absolute must-hire at all costs. She claimed this man was on an entirely different level compared to the petty Lord of Pious. Without him, the tournament would lose half its soul. The heavyweight figure in her crosshairs was none other than Duke David Berthier. The world had always hailed David Berthier as the gold standard of chivalry and perfection. He was the living embodiment of an ideal warrior, combining noble virtue with radiant honor. The success and star power of this upcoming Cartamen rested almost entirely on the esteemed Duke's nod of approval. A childhood memory suddenly flashed back, his older brother patting David's head, telling him not to worry because he would definitely return victorious from the blood match. Back then, young David had listened with wide, innocent eyes to his brother's parting words before he stepped into the lethal arena. His brother had offered a warm smile, reminding him that no matter what happened in the future, it would never be his fault. Yet the gruesome, bloody memory of his brother's death in that arena still gripped David's mind like a suffocating vice. It was an open, bleeding wound and a haunting trauma that time had never managed to heal. David woke up gasping in cold terror from the nightmare, clutching his chest with a pale, trembling face. Standing in the hallway listening to the servants gossiping, David's expression gradually hardened into a frosty glare. The butler loudly repeated Duke Berthier's ironclad warning sent to the royal messengers. The butler stressed that the Duke had threatened to behead anyone from the Cartamen committee who dared bother him again. David Berthier finally stepped forward with an imposing aura, demanding to know what the commotion was about outside his door. He coldly reiterated his threat to execute any Cartamen representative who dared get in his way. Edith stepped out with a confident smile, boldly asking if that beheading threat applied to her as well. David paused for a beat, unable to hide his shock at the princess's unannounced arrival. Quickly regaining his composure, the Duke admitted he was genuinely surprised to see the princess travel all this way in person. Taking a leisurely sip of tea, Edith cut straight to the chase, explaining that she desperately needed the Duke's presence to complete the tournament's vision. A noble sitting nearby immediately cut in, loudly declaring that the Duke had zero interest in entertaining such an invitation. He bitterly recalled how many knights had died pointless deaths and mocked the royal family's audacity in inviting the Duke to a similar spectacle. The man smugly claimed that as long as the new emperor refused to make proper concessions to the noble council, the Duke would never cooperate. David cut him off in a freezing tone, warning Lord Nias that he was making reckless assumptions and stepping way out of line. Duke David stated flatly that just because he wasn't fond of the new emperor didn't mean he was in league with self-serving nobles. David sharply exposed the hypocrisy of nobles who exploited commoners under the guise of heroism while sowing division in the imperial court. Cold sweat broke out on Lord Nias as he flusteredly waved his hands, claiming the Duke was misunderstanding his good intentions. David turned to Edith, expressing his desire to ask the princess one straightforward question. The Duke sternly demanded to know why the royal family wanted to resurrect Cartamen, a tournament long forgotten for 20 years, at this exact moment. Edith clenched her fist with conviction, proudly declaring that the goal was to revive the glorious founding tradition of the empire. David stared at her in silence for a long moment, before remarking that her answer sounded like a hollow, rehearsed script. Gripping the hilt of his sword, David pressed whether people in these chaotic times truly needed an excuse painted in the name of tradition. Edith reasoned that what the empire lacked most right now was unity. leaving David to sigh in deep contemplation. She reminded him that great rulers of the past used magical broadcast devices to communicate directly, listen to their people, and build a thriving nation. Edith passionately proclaimed that she wanted to bring that golden age back through Cartamen, sparking David's curiosity as to how she intended to pull it off. The princess laid out her grand vision of erecting broadcast towers across the empire, allowing citizens to watch live and cast their votes for the champion. David reminded her in a grave tone that the tyrant Beauvoir had smashed every single broadcast tower long ago to silence the people. David questioned how she could restore them when the original magic was lost, yet Edith insisted with absolute certainty that she could rebuild them all. Edith excitedly revealed that she had personally engineered a new visual broadcast device using alchemy to stream live footage to every citizen. David was stunned that a pampered princess could single-handedly invent magical devices with such massive coverage. Edith emphasized that the people would finally have a voice and personally choose the Daequus knights worthy of representing them. She was convinced that the collective spotlight on Cartamen would become an invisible thread binding the entire empire together as one. The princess sincerely hoped this tournament would help everyone realize that the dark days of violence and terror were truly behind them. After a long silence, David finally spoke up, offering a single condition in exchange for his participation. Seeing that he hadn't flatly refused, Edith's eyes lit up, and she eagerly asked what his condition was. David drew the sword at his hip, introducing it as the priceless relic of his late older brother. Stepping forward, David recalled the painful memory of how his brother had entered the lethal arena in his place when David was just a boy. His brother had fought valiantly to the bitter end and emerged as the final victor, yet he chose to end his own life with that very blade, rather than stoop to becoming the tyrant's henchman. A surge of fury made David suddenly slash his sword through the air with lethal precision. Pointing the cold blade straight at the royal guard Dmitri standing behind her, David coldly asked if the princess was testing his resolve. David declared that if he was permitted to personally execute the coward who had knelt before the tyrant, he would immediately agree to join. Edith urged the Duke to calm down so she could explain Dmitri's innocence, but David brushed her off in the name of knightly honor. Keeping his blade leveled at Dmitri, David firmly stated that if the princess shielded a traitor, he would never set foot in Cartamen. Edith closed her eyes and let out a tired sigh, admitting that if that was how it had to be, so be it. She decisively revoked her invitation and told the Duke he didn't need to concern himself with the tournament anymore, leaving David frozen in shock. Placing a hand over her heart, Edith proudly declared that she would never sacrifice a loyal knight just to achieve her own goals. Surprised, David reminded her of how desperately she needed him, but Edith casually replied that she would shoulder whatever fallout came from his refusal. Edith turned on her heel and walked away with absolute resolve, leaving the Duke rooted to the spot in disbelief. Watching her retreating figure, David bowed his head slightly, privately acknowledging that this princess was truly something else. He realized she was the complete opposite of the tyrant Beauvoir, who treated knights' lives like disposable pawns to be used and discarded. David suddenly called out after her, announcing that he had changed his mind and would officially register for her Cartamen tournament. Edith whipped around with a suspicious glare, asking if he had just been testing her, while David bowed apologetically for his little stunt. Brushing off the past in a heartbeat, Edith excitedly clapped her hands and asked if the Duke would do her one more tiny favor. Seeing the princess's overly enthusiastic smile, David broke into a cold sweat and cautiously asked what it was. A promotional clip played, showing a dapper David Berthier in a sharp suit, microphone in hand, passionately urging the public to choose their own knight. On the giant screen, the Supreme Commander of Knights flashed a captivating smile, placing all his trust in the audience's votes. Down below, the commoners buzzed with excitement, wide-eyed at the sight of a proud duke humbling himself to rally votes just like a celebrity. Edith beamed as she reviewed David's flawless profile, smirking proudly at how his charmingly stiff smile had already generated massive engagement. Seeing that even a duke who had suffered personal loss was willing to compete, the public began to trust that Cartamen was a legitimate tournament and rushed to sign up in droves. Notices explaining that citizens needed to register their identification at broadcast towers to vote fairly were distributed to every corner of the empire. A reporter marveled at how the princess had not only used the Duke as brilliant media bait, but also seamlessly driven a nationwide identification campaign in the process. The scholar jotted down notes, wondering whether this was pure genius or a calculated move by the princess to consolidate royal authority. The bespectacled man smirked with intrigue, praising Edith as a remarkably fascinating woman. A still capture showed David Berthier shining like a true star in the promotional video for the tournament. Thanks to the viral momentum of David's video, over 1,000 applications poured in, with organizers narrowing the pool down by half for preliminary interviews. Red-haired swordsman Killian Grushi poured his heart out, sharing that despite his humble roots, Cartamen was the greatest purpose of his life. Contestant Maurice Arnaud expressed his burning desire to prove to his family that he too had the right to chase a dream and step into the light. The bespectacled swordsman Pierre Simon emotionally recalled his master's words, that Cartamen was the single peak he was destined to conquer. The narrative shifted back to the final key player whom the princess was still fighting to recruit. Dmitri sat in somber silence, adamantly refusing because he believed having a branded traitor like him around would only poison the public's view of the tournament. Edith looked straight into his eyes, stating with absolute certainty that Dmitri was no traitor when he was the one who opened the castle gates for the rebels. Dmitri laughed bitterly at himself, saying everyone saw him as a spineless opportunist who simply jumped to the winning side when the tides turned. Edith revealed that Dmitri was the one who had secretly passed intelligence from the tyrant's stronghold to the rebels for years, leaving him utterly stunned. Staring at her in disbelief, Dmitri stammered, asking how the princess could possibly know a secret that no living soul was supposed to know. Edith gently explained that while circumstantial evidence might not convince the public, she had always believed in who he truly was. She urged Dmitri to step into the light and use the Cartamen arena to wash away the wrongful stigma that had weighed on him for so long. Dmitri hung his head in torment, arguing that even if he aided the rebellion, the fact remained that he had cut down countless comrades in the past, a stain he could never erase. Edith stepped closer, advising him to reclaim his honor and bring the full truth to light through his performance in the arena. The princess gently took Dmitri's hand, reminding him that a fair, resolute battle was the only true way to atone before those who had fallen. Edith looked deep into his eyes, asking whether he wanted them remembered as victims slain by a traitor or honored with heads held high for their noble sacrifice to the knightly ideal. She rallied Dmitri's spirit, assuring him that he had more than enough qualification and raw skill to compete fairly for a royal knight's seat. After tireless preparations, the roster of the top 100 elite contestants was finally unveiled for the opening assessment round. The opening trial, titled Solo Whack-A-Mole, with free choice of weaponry, left the contestants scratching their heads in utter confusion. Looking at the mechanical mole dummies, Kustu wondered why this felt suspiciously like basic recruit training. As he walked, Kustu figured that nobles trained by renowned martial academies would have all the advantages, leaving a self-taught ex-slave like him at a total disadvantage. His heart skipped a beat at the thought of getting kicked out in the very first round and dragged off to the gallows as originally bargained. Glancing around the waiting hall, Kustu noticed contestants gathering into tight factions based on their respective schools. He picked up on the subtle, silent power struggle brewing over the most prestigious seats up front. Telling himself he had no desire to stand out and only cared about surviving the round, Kustu slunk off to find a quiet, empty seat in the back. A blonde noble immediately stuck his leg across the aisle, arrogantly declaring that the seat was taken. The noble kicked his feet up over the neighboring chair as well, putting on an obnoxious, provocative smirk. Annoyed, Kustu demanded to know since when seats in this place belonged to anyone. The noble sneered contemptuously, mocking that if even a slave had an owner, it was only natural for a chair to have one too. He angrily complained about the organizers letting a former slave compete, wishing they hadn't confiscated his sword at the door so he could have dispatched him on the spot. Without a word, Kustu calmly tightened his gloved fists, his face turning cold with quiet menace. He coldly shot back that he had no problem throwing hands bare knuckle, making the noble flinch back and mumble that he wasn't worth the effort. Backing away in a huff, the noble barked at Kustu to go sit in the back row, but Kustu completely tuned him out. Sitting all alone among the rows of chairs, Kustu let out a weary sigh, wondering how on earth he was supposed to win votes to stay alive when the whole room already hated his guts. He clutched his head, fretting over the prospect of being executed after the prelims, while the blonde noble stormed off, complaining about his filth. The entire hall suddenly buzzed with excitement as an imposing figure stepped through the doors of the waiting room. The crowd of nobles swarmed around, gossiping excitedly about the distinguished guest's unexpected arrival. Everyone stared wide-eyed in utter disbelief that Duke David Berthier himself had actually showed up in the flesh to compete in this arena. The nobles crowded around to flatter him, competing to introduce themselves and flaunt their titles to curry favor with the esteemed duke. Watching the whole circus from afar, Kustu thought to himself that being insanely famous looked 10 times more exhausting than being universally hated. David cast a subtle glance toward the distant row where Kustu sat in solitary isolation. His entourage quickly moved to block him, urging him not to walk toward the lowly ex-slave and offering to escort him to the VIP seating instead. Brushing off all the hollow flattery, David Berthier marched forward with deliberate steps straight toward the rows of seats. The Duke strolled up and plopped down onto the empty seat right beside Kustu, leaving the former slave completely dumbfounded. David offered a warm, bright smile, remarking that he found this particular seat very much to his liking. Bewildered as to why the man of the hour chose to sit next to him, Kustu turned and asked if the Duke genuinely liked this spot. Flashing a radiant grin, David cheerfully replied that sitting here was 10,000 times easier to breathe than dealing with the noisy crowd over there. Kustu broke into a cold sweat, wondering how on earth a man could look at another man and smile with such suspicious warmth. David extended his hand to introduce himself, while Kustu shook it hesitantly, reminding himself to avoid direct eye contact since he suspected his neighbor was a weirdo. David suddenly leaned in remarkably close to Kustu, making the surrounding air feel instantly suffocating and bizarrely intimate. Kustu flinched in alarm as the prestigious Duke leaned his face straight against his ear. David whispered a secret, revealing that numerous magical recording orbs had been hidden around the arena to broadcast everything live. Kustu recalled the mention of recording devices in his invitation, marveling at how cleverly the organizers had concealed the cameras. It suddenly hit Kustu that every single dramatic moment earlier, including his heated verbal spat with the noble, had been captured on frame without missing a second. Turning to look at David, Kustu silently praised the stranger's exceptionally sharp and observant eye. David froze, asking in total bewilderment if Kustu genuinely had no idea who he was sitting next to. Scratching his head with an innocent shrug, Kustu asked why he was supposed to know and wondered if this Duke was supposed to be a big deal. David could only chuckle at such unbothered innocence, noting that it had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such casual nonchalance. Looking at the Duke's gleeful, eye-smiling face, Kustu broke into a sweat, dead certain that this high-born gentleman had a screw loose. The entire hall suddenly erupted into loud murmurs as a new figure loomed in the doorway. Everyone around stared in sheer horror, crying out in panic over how such a terrifying monster could brazenly walk into this place. David froze with wide eyes as he recognized the identity of the cloaked man who had just entered. Kustu glanced around in confusion, wondering what kind of powerhouse this newcomer was to send the entire room into such a chaotic frenzy. The whole situation had actually begun a few days earlier, the moment the silver-haired knight made his fateful decision. Dmitri had stood tall and declared he would join Cartamen for the honor of his fallen comrades, sending Edith leaping with joy as if she had struck gold. However, Dmitri immediately hit the brakes on her celebration with a non-negotiable condition before officially signing on. He strictly demanded that the princess never breathe a word to the other contestants or the public about his covert contributions to the revolution. Dmitri explained thoroughly that the public would never believe it, They would only think the princess was shielding a criminal, dragging the whole tournament into the mud. Understanding his point, Edith agreed immediately, though she didn't forget to remind him that the truth couldn't stay buried in a chest forever. Dmitri insisted that when the time was truly right, he would be the one to step forward and reveal the entire story himself. Back in the present, the crowd of contestants hurled venomous insults, calling Dmitri a soulless monster and the tyrant's loyal hunting dog. Cousteau glanced over at David and was surprised to realize that this newcomer was apparently despised and cursed even worse than he was. David recalled the princess's explanation of Dmitri's hidden grievances, telling himself she must have had her own strategic reasons for doing this. The surrounding nobles continued to whisper mockingly about the traitor's audacity in dreaming of winning a royal knight title to cleanse his dirty name. Cousteau watched for a while and noted that despite their loud bark, the silver-haired man's chilling aura kept every single one of them from daring to step up and pick a fight. Looking at the commanding presence of the silver-haired man, Cousteau smirked with curiosity, wondering which of the two was truly more hated in the public's eyes. The two strikingly handsome men sat side by side, their sheer magnetism dominating the entire corner of the room. Stage lights suddenly flared to life, illuminating the walkway as Princess Edith herself stepped out to host the event. Holding the microphone with a dazzling smile, Edith introduced herself as the host of Cartamen, leaving the contestants swooning over the genius alchemist's radiant beauty. The princess loudly declared the official entrance of the elite judging panel who would oversee the season. 3 majestic female knights marched onto the stage, prompting the noble contestants to exchange stunned glances, wondering who had the pedigree to judge their high-born ranks. Cousteau sat with his arms crossed in the corner, sporting a look of total confusion, since he had zero clue who the 3 judges were. David leaned in close to whisper in Cousteau's ear, explaining that they were the legendary Valkyria Knights of the Empire. The Valkyrias were an all-female royal knight order renowned as one of the most elite and fiercely loyal forces in history. Ironically, because the tyrant Beauvoir looked down on women wielding swords, he stripped them of their titles and exiled the entire order the moment he took power. The tyrant had even barred them from the blood matches, claiming women fighting would ruin the spectacle. During their years of exile, the Valkyria Knights had approached Carlos Lafayette, urging him to raise an army and serving as the vanguard that toppled the tyrant's rule. The day Carlos was formally crowned, the Valkyria Order was reinstated with the utmost glory and honor. Ever since, the prestige and authority of the female knights had reached unprecedented heights. Commander Amante Beckus, with her fiery red hair, opened coldly, stating she didn't expect much, but hoped the contestants would give it their all. Short-haired Vice Commander Inés Parto strictly gave a brief introduction of her role without wasting a single breath. Bubbly blonde knight Mila Pond cheerfully advised the contestants to put on a good show unless they wanted to get chewed out by her strict superiors. Thunderous applause erupted across the hall to welcome the powerhouse judging panel. Raising her microphone high, Edith officially kicked off the entry assessment round and called contestant number 01 to the stage. Contestant number 1, Pierre Simon, with his long hair and intellectual spectacles, calmly stood up and walked out under the scrutiny of countless eyes. Pierre received his designated test weapon, a heavy leather bullwhip. He strode forward with steady confidence straight into the trial zone. An arrogant, noble contestant muttered in contempt, dismissing the whack-a-mole trial as a pathetic game far beneath the dignity of a true aristocrat like him. The blonde noble and his cronies smugly agreed that a grand contest couldn't possibly be decided by some childish gimmick. He confidently mapped out a plan to whip the moles while showcasing his high-tier family martial arts to easily sweep first place. Within minutes of stepping onto the arena floor, the blonde noble was screaming in pure panic as he was chased relentlessly without room to breathe. Sprinting for his life, he bitterly realized the course was riddled with lethal traps instead of the gentle mole-tapping game he had envisioned. A massive rolling boulder suddenly came hurtling toward him, making him shriek in sheer terror. Barely dodging the boulder by a hair's breadth, he clutched his chest, panting heavily and rejoicing that he had survived. Before he could catch his breath, a heavy iron sphere slammed straight into his back, delivering a brutally painful blow. The mechanical mole puppets popped their heads up one after another, staring blankly at the contestants sprawled in total defeat on the floor. Edith held her microphone and let out a deep sigh, watching the trial devolve into moles hunting the human, while Judge Mila beside her laughed heartily, praising the princess's hilarious concept. Mila smiled and noted that out of the 55 contestants who had run the course, only a handful had shown any real competence, leaving the princess to offer a dry, awkward chuckle. Edith explained that she deliberately rigged hidden traps to weed out empty show-offs who relied purely on their fancy school names. The sight of faint-hearted contestants dropping like flies and getting wrecked by traps was clear proof of the trial's brutal standards. Mila fondly mentioned the young contestant swinging the giant broadsword as one of the few standout performances that had hyped up the crowd so far. Judge Ines also nodded in approval of the fisherman contestant, whose use of a fishing net as a weapon was both strikingly unique and effective. Amante admitted that contestant number 01 had delivered such a stellar opening that it had inadvertently set her expectations impossibly high for everyone else. Pierre Simon's fluid, mesmerizing whip routine, clearing every target with the grace of an art performance, remained burned into the judges' minds. Sadly, after that dazzling opener, the rest of the trial had unraveled into a continuous string of comedic disasters. Having taken a humiliating beating, the blonde noble clutched his aching shoulder and dragged his feet before the judging table. Flustered, he tried to excuse himself, claiming he hadn't warmed up properly and slipped by mistake. Amante sarcastically asked if he was warmed up now and wanted to go back in for another round to really get his engine going. The noble stammered and backed off, begging to reschedule because his mental state wasn't quite ready. The red-haired judge pressed him sharply. Would his mental state be ready tomorrow, the day after, in a month? Or did he need a whole year? The noble could only keep his head down in total silence, unable to utter a single word under her razor-sharp interrogation. Judge Ines let out an exhausted sigh and asked bluntly why someone like him had bothered to apply in the first place. Puffing out his chest, he claimed that as a proud nobleman, it was only natural to dream of becoming a glorious knight. Ines countered by asking if he only wanted to be a knight because he thought the job looked cool, prompting him to awkwardly nod and admit he had never seen a cooler profession. The judge asked sternly if that meant he would quit the moment the job stopped looking cool, leaving him stammering in utter embarrassment. Ines firmly laid down the truth. Being a knight wasn't about looking pretty. It was a brutal life of blood, wounds, and the stench of sweat. Amante chimed in, scolding him for showing up without even knowing what the word knight truly meant, asking if he had ever put in a single day of serious training in his life. Crossing her arms, Judge Amante coldly announced that the panel would recess for a private deliberation to finalize his score. The contestants in the back began whispering mockingly about the foolish noble, though they still speculated he might get saved by his aristocratic pedigree. Holding the score sheet, Edith prepared to announce the official ranking. The princess clearly read out the official rank assigned to Count Mancho following the judge's consultation. Mancho suffered a complete meltdown as the massive rank 5 stamped across the board. He threw a furious tantrum, screaming at the judges why he was at the bottom after blowing a fortune on the finest gear and lavish weapons. 2 guards had to rush over and pin him down as the noble began sobbing and whining that he had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into the trial. The screen faded to gray, stamping a solid rank 5 on the humiliated failure named Mancho. Holding her aching head, Edith realized true knights were tragically scarce after the tyrant had fed all the empire's talent into the meat grinder. The former director reminded herself that the audition rounds of reality shows were the perfect place to establish comedy relief characters to entertain viewers. Every archetype, from the sob story underdogs and clumsy fools to the flashy playboys, was a classic staple to hook an audience. This was a textbook media strategy designed to imprint contestant personas into viewers' minds right from episode 1. Yet, biting her nails as she watched the abysmal quality of the roster, Edith began to sweat that her show might flop from lack of viewership. She realized the tournament desperately needed an ace contestant to step up and command the entire public spotlight at this critical juncture. The two female judges exchanged knowing smiles as an absolute heavyweight prepared to enter the arena. Duke David Berthier, draped in magnificent royal attire, strode onto the field with an overpowering presence that lit up the entire arena. The judges noted with praise how remarkably calm and confident David looked, carrying the undeniable stature of a true duke. Resting her chin on her hand, Ines casually remarked that even the most talented men could still slip up now and then. Standing backstage with a wide grin, Edith silently cheered David on, praying he would deliver killer footage for the opening teaser. David stepped into the winding stone labyrinth alone, his sharp sword held firmly in hand. With a single decisive slash that tore through the air, David cleanly cleaved the mechanical targets in two without breaking a sweat. Red-haired Judge Amante watched in shock as she recognized the powerful, familiar swordplay of the Duke. Every precise stroke swatted away incoming arrow traps, bearing the unmistakable hallmark of Hugo Berthier's legendary swordsmanship. Judge Mila instantly recognized the weapon in David's hands as the Blue Lion sword, the only priceless heirloom left behind by his brother Hugo. David wielded his late brother's blade in the heat of battle, unleashing flawless strikes without a single imperfection. David's radiant figure shone brilliantly on the giant broadcast screen, not only captivating the entire audience, but also weaving a deeply heroic and emotional narrative. Watching the screen with absolute satisfaction, Edith praised her own sharp eye for talent and top-tier recruiting skills. Judges Inés Parto and Amante Beques maintained serious expressions before Inés stepped up to announce the assessment results. Princess Edith raised the microphone with a bright smile, preparing to announce the official ranking for Duke David Berthier. David swept the highest score, earning rank 1, and offered a polite, graceful bow of thanks to the judges. David's eyes watched intently as Edith called contestant number 57 to the stage. Resting his chin with a slight smile, David thought to himself that it was finally his acquaintance's turn to show what he had. Checking the roster with slight apprehension, Edith wondered why Cousteau's turn had to land right after David's flawless performance. Cousteau strode onto the stage under the astonished gazes of the entire crowd. Whispers broke out as spectators saw Cousteau competing bare-chested, his muscles bulging, and completely empty-handed without a single weapon. The contestants questioned Cousteau's bizarre confidence in entering without armor or a sword, while Edith fretted that he was about to get torn to shreds by the strict judges. Edith broke into a sweat and swallowed hard, dreading the moment the formidable judges would chew him out mercilessly. Maintaining an icy poker face, Cousteau marched with steady, decisive steps straight into the stone maze. A wooden trap suddenly sprang loose with a vicious whoosh, prompting Cousteau to twist his body and dodge it in a split second. Having dodged the deadly blow, Cousteau muttered to himself that the trap had nearly startled the life out of him. A rapid volley of sharp arrows came raining in, convincing everyone that dodging them barehanded was mission impossible. Cousteau's sharp eyes tracked the trajectory of the incoming traps from every angle. With superhuman reflexes, Cousteau snatched a flying spear trap out of midair and smashed it down, shattering the charging boulder obstacle to pieces. The judges marveled at his brilliant counter-tactic, while the jealous nobles sneered that he was just an ex-slave relying on brute muscle. The narration silently praised the young man's innate flair for igniting pure excitement in the hearts of the audience. Edith clutched her chest, her eyes sparkling with delight at his remarkably slick adaptability. Cousteau flashed a confident grin and raised the severed head of the mechanical dummy high, exuding the undeniable aura of a true superstar. Hands behind his back, Cousteau stood calmly before the judging table of the three powerful female knights. Judge Mila let out a hearty laugh, asking how on earth he had cleared the entire labyrinth bare-handed without using a single weapon. Crossing her arms, Judge Amante reminded him that the rules required bringing a weapon and that a lack of preparation meant point deductions, demanding to know why he did it. Cousteau confessed honestly that his pockets were bone dry, having spent his very last coins on traveling expenses to reach the capital. Amante listed armor, weapons, a war horse, and chivalric spirit as the bare essentials for any swordsman, meaning he lacked every single one. Cousteau explained that he would have loved to gear up properly, but his empty wallet tied his hands. Seated high above, David stifled a laugh behind his hand at Cousteau's completely unapologetic honesty. The judge asked if he had ever formally trained in swordsmanship or spear techniques, to which Cousteau gave a flat, definitive no. The three judges leaned in to whisper and deliberate on the final grade for his weaponless triumph. Edith looked down at the result sheet in mild shock, then cleared her throat to announce Cousteau's score. Edith loudly declared that contestant Cousteau had officially received a rank 2 rating. Cousteau showed a flicker of surprise before quickly bowing to thank the judges for their leniency. The narration noted that knighthood had always been an exclusive playground for the wealthy, due to the exorbitant cost of gear. Edith smugly thought that Cousteau was the ultimate underdog figure to capture public sympathy and reel in a tidal wave of commoner votes. Amante murmured that the boy had immense raw potential, expressing a keen interest in personally forging him into a master. Cousteau marched up to the rank 2 seating area, taking in the full panoramic view below. Sitting down in rank 5, the noble Mancho ground his teeth in pure rage, refusing to accept that a former slave was sitting ranks above him. Testing out the chair, Cousteau silently marveled at how much more luxurious and comfortable the rank 2 seating was compared to standard benches. He was amazed that a dirt-poor nobody like him could outrank nobility, silently praising the tournament for being unimaginably fair. Looking up at the pinnacle rank 1 throne above, a flicker of ambition sparked in Cousteau, wondering if he could ever climb to the very top. In the quiet atmosphere, David and Cousteau's eyes locked across the distance. Cousteau burned with determination to reach rank 1 at all costs, while David sat above with a knowing, subtle smirk. The scoreboard announced subsequent contestants. Academy valedictorian Olivier earned rank 2, while orphanage director Raphael secured rank 1. The judging panel began to look bored as the later contestants delivered lackluster, uninspired performances. Mila tried to liven up the room by noting they were down to the final contestant, though Ines felt there was little to get excited about in this snooze fest. A judge let out a quiet sigh of relief that this exhausting assessment round was finally drawing to a close. Edith's eyes widened as she watched the final contestant stride onto the arena grounds. Edith raised her microphone and called the last contestant up to the starting line. Dimitri emerged wrapped in a heavy cloak, amidst a storm of furious boos and vile curses, from contestants demanding to kick out the tyrant's traitorous dog. The princess clearly announced contestant number 100 as Dimitri Cassel. Edith noticed that Dimitri's face was extremely tense under the suffocating pressure of the crowd's hostility. She silently prayed that the silver-haired knight would keep his composure and avoid making any costly mistakes. Dimitri entered the maze, deftly drawing his bow to land bullseye after bullseye, while effortlessly dodging incoming traps. A resolute crimson glow flashed in Dimitri's eyes as he drew the bowstring taut in an instant. Focusing with intense precision, he locked onto a mechanical target in freefall from above. Edith gasped and covered her mouth in genuine panic at the heart-stopping high-stakes move. Dimitri flipped mid-air in an inverted spin, unleashing a deadly flurry of arrows that pinned the mole target's dead center in breathtaking fashion. Dimitri landed softly, catching his breath amidst a picturesque shower of falling petals. The noble contestants in the back sneered in contempt, dismissing the flashy display as a cheap circus trick anyone could pull off. Edith placed a hand over her chest and exhaled in relief, seeing that he had finished the trial safely and with absolute brilliance. The three judges couldn't hide their awe and admiration at Dimitri's masterful marksmanship. Judge Inez stepped forward and asked point-blank for the real reason he had chosen to enter the competition. Dimitri held his head high and answered calmly that he came seeking forgiveness and peace from the court of his own conscience. Edith's eyes widened in surprise at the knight's raw, profound honesty. Inez pressed further, asking if that meant he currently couldn't accept the person he had become. Dimitri looked the judges straight in the eye and admitted that what she said was entirely accurate. Judge Mila smirked slightly, preparing to drop a sensitive, make-or-break question. Mila asked bluntly whether he had ever regretted serving under the tyrant as a royal knight. Sweating bullets, Edith silently pleaded for Dmitri not to be stubborn and just say he regretted it to placate the hostile public. Dmitri's lips parted slightly, preparing to deliver his final answer. Dmitri declared with absolute clarity that he didn't feel a single shred of regret, leaving Judge Mila completely stunned. Dmitri added that remorse would be his answer if he wanted to lie to win their favor, but in truth, even if time turned back to the beginning, he firmly maintained that his choice back then would remain exactly the same. The entire auditorium instantly erupted into a deafening uproar of outrage, with people hurling curses and trash straight at Dmitri. Edith clutched her forehead and let out a massive sigh at the silver-haired knight's brutally blunt and unyielding stubbornness. The scoreboard revealed that Dmitri had received rank 2, despite his combat prowess ranking among the absolute peak of the roster. The narration explained that Dmitri carried a fatal flaw that barred him from claiming the prestigious top spot. The judges reminded everyone that a knight's virtue wasn't measured solely by strength, while other contestants sneered in disgust at his traitor label. Dmitri quietly walked up to the rank 2 section and took the empty seat right next to Kustu. Kustu glanced over and realized he couldn't stop himself from worrying about this deeply burdened man. Kustu smiled dryly, wondering if it was because he felt they shared the same fate of being outcasts despised by the world. Dmitri suddenly turned to look right at him, making Kustu jump in flustered embarrassment. Seated calmly on the rank 1 throne above, David quietly observed his two fellow contestants exchanging awkward glances. David gazed across the entire room just as the bell chimed to assemble all contestants. Edith beamed with a bright smile into the microphone, declaring that the entry assessment round had officially concluded. The princess prepared to transition into explaining the crucial perks and privileges of the competition. Edith enthusiastically unveiled the custom rewards and exclusive benefits tailored for each specific rank tier. The contestants leaned in with eager curiosity, as Edith invited everyone to direct their eyes forward. Rows of combat armor were brought out, and Edith explained that while everyone received armor, the quality strictly matched their rank. The rank 1 armor was forged with gilded plating, sturdier than a tower shield yet featherlight, allowing for maximum agility. Conversely, the lower the rank, the noticeably worse the armor's durability and defense became. The rank 5 contestants grumbled in bitter outrage, claiming their paper-thin armor was blatant discrimination. Edith smiled and reassured them that the organizers had prepared special training regimens for each group to bridge the gap. She announced that contestants would be taught a brand new swordsmanship style exclusively created by the Valkyria Knights. This prestigious secret style would be personally taught by the 3 formidable Valkyria judges themselves. The entire hall exploded in pure excitement at the once-in-a-lifetime chance to learn Valkyria swordsmanship, while Edith smiled with smug satisfaction. Commander Amante drew her blade with majestic authority, announcing the start of the demonstration and ordering all contestants to watch with absolute focus. Amante unleashed a blistering, space-cleaving slash, her golden eyes blazing with fierce, razor-sharp intent. Kustu broke into a cold sweat watching the demonstration, thinking that an insane difficulty like that was practically asking him to hand over his head. Beside him, Dmitri was already muttering under his breath, his hands swiftly mimicking the exact motions of the sword form he had just witnessed. Kustu stared wide-eyed, wondering if this guy had a photographic memory to memorize such complex movements after a single glance. He marveled to himself that at this rate, the silver-haired swordsman could probably replicate the exact technique on his very first attempt. Edith hyped up the room with her mic, asking the contestants if their hearts were racing to master this magnificent swordsmanship. While the crowd below stood dazed and struggling to process what they saw, the princess dropped another crucial bombshell. Edith gently reminded them that their performance during special training could flip the rankings at any time, so they better stay sharp. The princess cheerfully announced the conclusion of the entry assessment and thanked all contestants for their hard work. Exhausted, the contestants complained about the brutal test, admitting they could never copy that sword style, and prepared to head out to rest. One contestant muttered that he couldn't wait to hit his bed and pass out after such a nerve-wracking evaluation. Everyone suddenly froze in dropped-jaw shock as the female judges unexpectedly re-emerged, armed to the teeth in full battle gear. Commander Amante Bekis, in her imposing battle armor, loudly declared that special training began effective immediately. David, Kustu, and Dmitri all looked stunned by the organizers' sudden, relentless pacing. The order was barked out. All contestants had to gear up immediately and assemble at their designated training grounds without delay. Panic broke out as contestants shouted in dismay at being herded into training without even a single minute to catch their breath. The judges issued a blunt warning. The last person to reach the grounds would receive an immediate, merciless rank demotion. The moment the signal sounded, the entire hall erupted into chaotic pandemonium as everyone scrambled to grab their iron armor. Commander Amante Bekes wore a mysterious smirk, coldly watching the contestants scatter in utter frenzy. Kustu struggled in a cold sweat with the confusing buckles, having never laid a finger on such intricate metal armor in his entire life. David Berthier suddenly appeared behind him, leaning in to ask if Kustu needed a hand getting his armor fastened. Startled, Kustu waved him off, insisting he could manage, but David pointed out that his clumsy fumbling said otherwise. David smoothly reached around to adjust every single strap for Kustu, leaving the former slave completely frozen in shock. Each metal clasp was snapped into place with precision amidst Kustu's flustered, breathy sighs. Fastening the final buckle, David softly whispered that everything was all set. David strolled away casually, leaving behind a light remark that Kustu didn't need to bother thanking him. Kustu stood frozen, staring after him in total bewilderment, wondering what game this duke was actually playing. Commander Amante stepped onto the training grounds, sternly taking roll call to see if everyone had assembled. Amante coldly announced the penalty awaiting those who had failed to arrive on time. The commander ruthlessly demoted the latecomers straight down to rank 3, banishing them to the rank 3 and 4 training fields. Kustu and the others gasped as a rank 1 contestant dropped 2 full ranks just for being a few seconds late. Kustu glanced at David, silently grateful that if the Duke hadn't helped him buckle his armor, he would have met the exact same miserable fate. Amante declared the start of sword practice, ordering everyone to train independently before taking individual tests. The crowd murmured in despair, feeling it was utterly impossible to replicate such god-tier swordplay after seeing it only once. A journalist gazed out the window, voicing a deeply skeptical question about the legitimacy of the rumors surrounding the tournament. The draft of his article posed the big question: was Cartamen the Empire's salvation, or merely another disguised, bloody slaughterhouse? Journalist Norman insisted that as a true writer, he only reported what he believed to be the absolute truth. The editor-in-chief slammed the desk, angrily asking if he had already forgotten the horrifying lessons bled under the tyrant's reign. The editor recalled in panic how Norman had been thrown into a dungeon and brutally tortured by royal knights, dreading history repeating itself. Norman calmly asked the editor if he remembered the first oath of honor he took after surviving that living hell. The bespectacled reporter stated with conviction that he would never use fear as a cowardly excuse to hide the truth from the public. The editor pleaded with Norman to reconsider, arguing that as the Empire's most trusted voice, dropping this story would trigger an uncontrollable earthquake. Adjusting his glasses, Norman asked why the paper was named Justice and Truth, if running from the truth out of fear meant abandoning their own founding creed. He promised that if any trouble arose, he would take the fall entirely on his own without dragging the agency down. Placing a resolute hand on the manuscript, Norman earnestly requested his chief's approval to publish the investigative report. The sharp clatter of blades echoed across the training ground as contestants began drilling the swordsmanship routine. Kustu observed that contestants naturally split into factions, crowding around the master swordsman to pick up their technique. The field quickly divided into 2 clear camps gathered around Duke David and another elite swordsman. Kustu sighed, seeing David suffocated by such a thick crowd that he couldn't find an opening to slip in and say thanks. The contestants showered praise on swordsman Kilman of the Faust School, as he effortlessly memorized and performed the sword form with fluid speed. Watching Kilman drill, Kustu noted that while he copied well, his form left glaring, lethal openings. An aggressive noble barked loudly, chasing away a former slave like Kustu and forbidding him from peeking at Kilman's technique. Kustu turned away and coldly shot back that there was nothing special about that technique worth stealing, telling the nobles to enjoy their little circle. Kustu sighed at the intense hostility of the nobles, knowing that swimming alone would make it impossible to maintain his rank. Glancing toward David, he saw the Duke was still completely surrounded by fawning sycophants. A faint smile crossed Kustu's lips as he suddenly realized he had one viable backup plan left. He spotted the silver-haired knight Dmitri practicing all alone in a completely deserted corner of the yard. Kustu took the initiative and walked over, asking if Dmitri would help guide him through the new sword style. Dmitri froze in surprise, asking blankly if Kustu was talking to him, to which Kustu confirmed he wanted to learn after seeing his clean technique. Dmitri stared wide-eyed at the young man, utterly lost for words. Seeing him stay silent, Kustu wondered if the man held prejudices against former slaves like everyone else. Kustu said he was free to turn him down if he disliked it, but Dmitri quickly waved his hands in denial and eagerly agreed to help. Excited, Kustu asked if he was sure he wouldn't regret teaching him. Kustu explained that he simply wanted to learn swordsmanship and couldn't care less about past scandals, so Dmitri had nothing to worry about. Dmitri nodded with enthusiastic eagerness, making Kustu wonder why this guy was even more excited than the student asking for lessons. Watching Dmitri's over-the-top enthusiasm, Kustu thought to himself that this man truly possessed a uniquely eccentric personality. After a sweat-drenched practice session, Dmitri panted and praised Kustu for learning far faster than expected, eagerly telling him to repeat the stance so he could adjust his posture. Kustu swung his sword and carefully asked if his posture was correct. Dmitri stepped right up behind him, meticulously correcting the placement of his hands down to the millimeter. He instructed that the left pinky had to hook tightly around the very base of the hilt to maintain balance. Dmitri continued adjusting his right thumb and index finger to lightly cradle the grip, while Kustu followed every step with razor focus. Standing nearby while coaching others, David shot annoyed glances over, wondering why Kustu had asked Dmitri for lessons when his own swordsmanship was far superior. Distracted, David told his student to step back a bit, his eyes never leaving the two across the yard. David's chilling, jealous gaze watched their intimate practice session just as the bell chimed to end the training block. Dmitri said regretfully that just one or two more rounds would have allowed Kustu to master the entire form. Kustu smiled and said that while it was a shame, time was up, so they had to face the real assessment as they were. Commander Amante Beckus stepped forward with commanding authority, calling Duke David Berthier as the first to take the test. David stepped decisively onto the field, unleashing a ferocious, razor-sharp slash that tore cleanly through the air. Amante smirked with satisfaction, privately assessing that David's strike was so impeccably precise, it was practically flawless, just like her own technique. Amante called the next Rank 1 contestant, Raphael Laurent, to step up and perform. Raphael fumbled clumsily and gasped for air, prompting a furious tongue-lashing from Amante, who regretted ever giving him Rank 1 before ordering him back in line. The commander issued a stern warning to the entire roster that nobody was entitled to stay in Rank 1 without putting in serious work. Sweating nervously, Kustu noted that watching this female judge from afar was terrifying enough on its own. Amante suddenly barked out the next name, Kustu, making his heart leap into his throat. Kustu lunged forward and executed a sharp, powerful slash, following the exact steps he had just been drilled on. Standing with crossed arms, Amante stared him down and coldly commented that he possessed zero basic foundation in swordsmanship. The female knight pointed out that he was merely cramming and mechanically copying physical movements like a parrot. Amante strictly drilled into him that swordsmanship wasn't a memorized script. It had to become raw survival instinct if he didn't want to die on the battlefield. Kustu bowed respectfully to accept the critique, promising that he would grind and train twice as hard moving forward. The surrounding nobles chuckled mockingly, sneering that a lowly slave had no business touching a noble sword style. Dmitri walked over with a gentle smile, quietly praising Cousteau for a job well done. Dmitri patted his new friend's shoulder, comforting him not to lose heart, because he would do much better next time. Cousteau nudged him playfully with his shoulder, teasing that Dmitri spoke as if he had already finished his own test and aced it. Standing in the distance, David gave a smug thumbs up with a deeply satisfied expression. Seeing the Duke's baffling antics, Cousteau grimaced in confusion, wondering what new scheme this high-born gentleman was cooking up now. The judge called the next contestant to the field, Dmitri Cassel. Dmitri exhaled softly and drew his sword with regal authority, sinking into a rock-solid guard. Commander Amante broke into a radiant smile, showering Dmitri's breathtaking sword form with praise and declaring it unquestionably worthy of rank 1. Dmitri beamed with gratitude amid hearty applause as the judge called the next contender. Amante furiously scolded the following contestants for taking the trial lightly, warning that they would have been dead long ago on a real battlefield before kicking them off. The judge muttered in bewilderment, wondering why all these contestants shared the exact same bizarre movement habits she had never seen before. Commander Amante Bekis loudly called Kilman of the Faust School to the arena amidst enthusiastic cheers from the crowd. Draped in gleaming golden armor, Kilman strode forward with supreme confidence under Amante's icy glare. Amante's sharp gaze locked onto his footing, instantly spotting something terribly wrong with his technique. Kilman finished his routine, casually brushing his hair back with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Amante stated in a low, grim voice that Kilman was the ringleader behind the whole mess, leaving him blinking in confusion at her words. Amante exposed the truth. She had wondered why so many rookies shared the same ridiculous bad habits, and it turned out they had all been copying Kilman. Kilman tried to defend his form as flawless, but Amante laid into him, stating that while it looked flashy on the outside, it was a convoluted mess of useless flourishes she never taught. Called out in front of the entire assembly, Kilman broke into a nervous sweat, stammering that the Faust School believed true swordsmanship should always be expressive. Amante snapped back that this was where they drilled Valkyria swordplay, not the Faust playground for him to dance around however he pleased. The knight strictly corrected Kilman's flawed mindset, pointing out that using swordsmanship just to show off was the mark of someone who knew nothing about the blade. Amante held up Cousteau as an example, stating that if he was going to dance around like that, he would be better off learning from Cousteau's focus and sheer grit, making Cousteau flinch nearby. The judge stressed that at least Cousteau dedicated himself to learning Valkyria swordplay and trained with sincerity, delivering a crushing blow to Kilman's massive ego. Whispers and pointing broke out across the crowd, leaving Kilman burning with red-hot embarrassment. Kilman flushed crimson with mingled rage and shame as Amante called an end to today's session, ordering everyone to keep drilling for the re-evaluation. The contestants chorused their thanks and began shuffling off the training grounds. Exhausted and lacking the energy to drag themselves home, everyone agreed to crash at the nearby free dormitories for the night. Cousteau sighed wearily, seeing the dorms completely packed, annoyed that wealthy nobles with giant estates refused to go home and chose to crowd here instead. The sound of quiet sobbing made people turn and ask why contestant Pierre Simon, who was showered with praise earlier, was suddenly weeping his eyes out. Cousteau watched with curiosity, wondering what could possibly make an aristocrat who worked as a coachman and whipped like a master cry with such bitter sorrow. Clutching his face, Pierre sobbed that he had fallen short of perfection, terrified that if his master saw this, he would have whipped him within an inch of his life. Breaking into a sweat, Cousteau whipped his head away, convinced that this noble was definitely carrying some serious psychological issues. The former slave reminded himself that the safest way to maintain his peace of mind was to steer well clear of such eccentric weirdos. From the balcony, Edith observed the somewhat bleak and fragmented atmosphere over at the Rank 5 training yard. A contestant in gray armor was swinging his hammer with fierce dedication amid encouraging cheers from his peers. The young man resolved to give it everything he had to legitimately climb up to Rank 1 through sheer merit. The profile card introduced Maurice Arnaud as the group's comedic mood maker, alongside the question of why the heir to the wealthy Arnaud Merchant Guild had shown up here. Resting her chin with a cheerful grin, Judge Mila Pond offered some brutally blunt encouragement, telling them to keep up that exact pace to secure a one-way ticket to elimination. Hearing Mila's soul-crushing critique, the rank 5 contestants turned pale with fright, clinging to one another in utter despair. Slumped at her desk, Edith removed her glasses and sighed with relief as her grueling days of overtime finally reached the finish line. The former director pressed the final save button on her keyboard. Edith slumped completely over her desk in utter exhaustion, letting out a relieved groan as the screen flashed, "Save successful." Her aide, Frederick, suddenly burst through the door in a panic, urgently reporting to the princess that a major crisis had just struck. Lying flat on the desk, Edith waved a dismissive hand, mumbling that any crisis could wait because her centuries' worth of built-up exhaustion was the real disaster right now. Frederick slammed a newspaper onto the desk, announcing that a scathing critique of Cartamen had just been published. Hearing news of an exposé before the show had even aired, Edith shot straight up, wide awake and eager to see the drama. Edith held the paper in front of her face, reading every line of the biting, sarcastic analysis with keen focus. Sweating nervously, Frederick asked whether the princess could handle the intense pressure of this negative public backlash. To his shock, Edith threw her head back and burst into hearty laughter, leaving her attendant terrified she had lost her mind from shock. Flashing a bright smile, Edith insisted she was totally fine, even grateful that journalist Norman's scathing review had handed the tournament massive free publicity without costing a dime. Frederick reminded her that Norman was a sharp pen capable of swaying public opinion across the empire, but Edith replied she knew full well he was simply a champion of the people's truth. Edith immediately ordered her aide to round up copies of the critical article and distribute them to every single newsstand across the empire without missing a spot. Frederick was baffled as to why the royal family would actively spread an article slamming themselves, but Edith smiled and asked if he couldn't see the big brain play behind it. The princess explained that doing this proved to the citizens the crown wasn't censoring the press, earning goodwill while conveniently building massive hype for the tournament. Taking a stroll, Cousteau told himself that staying cooped up in the dorms wasting time sleeping was utterly pointless. He figured that at this late hour, the training grounds would be completely deserted, the golden window to squeeze in some extra practice. The moment he arrived, Cousteau froze in shock to see the training grounds ablaze with light, swarming with overachievers swinging their swords like it was a bustling festival. Dmitri, with his jacket slung over his shoulder, spotted Cousteau and cheerfully called out his name. The two men pointed at each other simultaneously and chuckled, asking if the other had landed in the exact same awkward predicament. Dmitri smiled sheepishly, guessing whether Cousteau had also just been kicked out by his roommates. Dmitri blinked with an innocent look, pressing Cousteau to see if he had genuinely been tossed out onto the street, just like him. Breaking into a sweat, Cousteau wondered if this guy had actually gotten kicked out of his room for real. Cousteau cleared his throat to save face, insisting that nobody kicked him out and that he had walked out purely on his own accord. He explained that he had greeted everyone first, but when not a single soul bothered to utter a word back, his pride took a hit, so he just walked out. Seeing Dmitri slump into a corner looking utterly dejected after realizing he was the only one who had actually been kicked out, Cousteau felt a sudden pang of guilt. Cousteau quickly changed the subject, laughing it off as he invited Dmitri into the yard to spar and asked for pointers on a few moves he hadn't mastered. Hearing someone ask for his guidance, Dmitri's face lit up instantly, eagerly telling Cousteau to point out whatever was troubling him so he could walk him through it. Watching his radiant smile, Cousteau wondered how a man branded as the Empire's notorious traitor could possibly be so remarkably gentle and kind-hearted. Cousteau raised his sword and demonstrated the thrust and pivot move that had him stumbling, prompting Dmitri to step in and demonstrate it step by step. With laser focus, Cousteau swung his sword, mimicking the exact motions he had just been shown. Dmitri watched for a moment, then casually dropped the deadpan remark that Cousteau's swordsmanship hadn't improved in the slightest. Rubbing his chin thoughtfully, Dmitri mused that since it clearly wasn't from a lack of effort, Kustu simply must have zero natural talent for the sword. Breaking into a cold sweat as his face darkened, Kustu realized the reason this guy was universally despised and isolated was definitely his brutally blunt inability to sugarcoat anything. Out of nowhere, the two overheard the sound of clumsy training shouts echoing from the far corner of the yard. Raphael was struggling to swing a heavy sword, his footwork stumbling and completely off balance. Maurice stood beside him, clapping and laughing that Raphael's swordplay was just as terrible as his own, leaving Raphael scratching his head with an awkward grin. Maurice pointed out that Raphael's last movement had gone in completely the wrong direction. Maurice demonstrated the move himself, earning lavish praise from a delighted Raphael, who was eager to try it again. Maurice praised Raphael for being a quick study after just one look, while Raphael humbly deflected the compliment, insisting Maurice was far better than him. From a distance, Kustu and Dmitri stood utterly speechless, watching the two rookies shamelessly shower each other with compliments. Kustu and Dmitri stepped closer and politely excused themselves to interrupt the two beginners' discussion. Dmitri raised his sword high above his head in textbook form, noting that while they might not like it, this was how the strike was actually meant to be swung. Kustu walked up and tapped Maurice on the shoulder, mentioning that while he was a beginner too, he'd advise relaxing the shoulders a bit when striking. Maurice and Raphael's eyes went wide in pure admiration as they cheered, amazed by how spot-on their guidance was. Maurice grabbed both of their hands and passionately begged Kustu and Dmitri to take them on as disciples and teach them swordsmanship. Kustu privately noted that although this was their first time meeting, Maurice was incredibly lively, open-minded, and easy to talk to. Kustu recalled how Maurice had cheerfully given up his seat in the lobby to the guy who beat him in arm wrestling, showing just how genuinely easygoing he was. Dmitri hesitated, asking if Maurice truly didn't know who he was, to which Maurice brightly replied that he was obviously the famous knight Dmitri Cassel. Dmitri's eyes went wide in bewilderment as he asked why, knowing all that notorious baggage, Maurice would still want him as a master. Maurice waved his hand, explaining that coming from a merchant family, he was eager to learn from anyone as long as it brought value and improvement. Glancing at Raphael to gauge his thoughts, Raphael scratched his head and chuckled, saying that in his position he had no right to be picky, so any guidance was a blessing. Dmitri was so deeply moved by their unconditional acceptance that he choked up, on the verge of tears. Kustu quickly patted their shoulders, telling them to ignore the silver-haired guy's random emotional outbursts, while Raphael sweated nervously, wondering if learning from him was truly safe. Wiping his tears with a radiant grin, Dmitri drew his sword and proudly declared the official start of their group training session. Watching from the shadows with a sneer, Kilman mocked that a bunch of amateurs gathering together wouldn't change a single thing. The narration noted that from that day on, the four of them drilled tirelessly together every single day without missing a beat. Watching from afar, David reflected that while he had worried Kustu would be ostracized for his slave origins, the young man had blended in and bonded with others faster than anyone could have imagined. The Duke clenched his fists in burning jealousy, right as a nearby noble walked up and asked David if he found that dirty slave an eyesore as well. The noble sneered, scoffing that Kustu was ridiculously arrogant for a lowly former slave to dream of climbing to the prestigious rank of royal knight. David didn't even bother replying, standing up abruptly and striding away, leaving the gossip dumbfounded. Patting the man on the shoulder, David coldly declared that he had already lost to Kustu a long time ago. David smirked, mocking that the man's vision and intellect were leagues behind Kustu's, and advised him to fix his own pathetic swordsmanship instead of talking behind people's backs. David turned on his heel and walked off, leaving the noble bowing and stammering apologies in sheer shame and dread. Clutching his chest in utter confusion, the noble wondered when on earth the esteemed duke and that filthy slave had gotten so close. A few weeks later, the magnificent castle stood tall on the eve of Cartamen's first official re-evaluation. Edith held a strategy meeting with the Valkyria judging panel, eager to hear the female knight's first-hand impressions after weeks of training to see if any real standouts had emerged. Flipping through the dossiers, Mila noted that the rank 5 contestants all possessed such wildly unique quirks that it was impossible to pick just one. The meeting carried on in a lively, relaxed atmosphere between the princess and the three formidable female knights. Mila clapped her hands in sudden realization, recalling that one person who left an exceptionally strong impression was Maurice Arnaud. Edith's eyes lit up as she asked if that was the heir to the renowned Arnaud Merchant Guild, and Mila happily confirmed that despite being in rank 5, he radiated pure, infectious positivity. The instructor spoke highly of the contestants' relentless work ethic, confident that he would skyrocket up the ranks in the upcoming assessment. When the princess wondered why he had joined the contest in the first place, the answer came that he simply wanted to be a knight, even if his current skills were astonishingly terrible. She privately deduced that his true motivation for entering the fray likely stemmed from a complicated family situation. She analyzed the fierce inheritance struggle after the Arnaud guild leader went through 5 wives, subjecting Maurice to stepmother pressure and driving him to use the tournament to regain his standing, before turning to Ines about the other groups. Ines could only shake her head with a sigh, stating that ranks 3 and 4 were fairly lackluster, before being asked specifically about the duo Denis and Pavel. Ines instantly recalled the mismatched big and small pair, remarking that, skill aside, they clung to her like lost puppies, not to mention being from her hometown. The princess excitedly jotted down notes, seeing that the hometown angle would provide plenty of golden comedic material, before asking Amante about ranks 1 and 2. Amante affirmed that all contestants were in peak form, except for one particular individual who wouldn't stop weighing on her mind. The princess smiled and nailed the guess that she was referring to Cousteau in rank 2, leaving Amante wide-eyed in surprise. She playfully teased that everyone noticed how Amante constantly scrutinized Cousteau, chewed him out mercilessly, and claimed his skills deserved bottom rank. Amante analyzed that while a former slave should have been riddled with bad swordsmanship habits, Cousteau possessed remarkably clean, precise strikes that would put veteran knights to shame. Amante admitted she recognized the diamond in the rough within Cousteau and wanted to push him to his absolute limits, making the princess realize the judge genuinely favored and placed immense hope in him. The princess silently likened Amante's fiery gaze to that of professors who had just scouted a high-potential student to take under their wing as a prized protégé. A young newsboy dashed through the bustling streets, shouting at the top of his lungs about a front-page article taking aim directly at the imperial court. The front page blared a headline column by journalist Norman Fossa, posing the grand question of whether Cartamen was the empire's cure or merely another disguised slaughterhouse. The author of the piece was utterly stunned to see his work, which pointed its spear straight at the royal family, being sold openly on the streets without being censored or confiscated. The public buzzed with excitement over the report, beginning to feel a fresh breeze as the government dared to face criticism head-on. The journalist was deeply moved, wondering if the new regime genuinely wanted to bury the dark era, while respecting the crown's courage to face public scrutiny to rebuild the people's trust. The reporter offered sincere, heartfelt praise, acknowledging that Princess Edith had pulled off a masterclass move that far exceeded all his initial expectations.